Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this special edition of the Demolition Daily Livestream. I'm your host, Mark Anthony. Really appreciate you being here. I realise this is an early one for you. Now, as some of you may know, the Large Combustion Plant Directive was a European Union directive that required a number of member states to limit flue gas emissions from certain combustion plants. Under the terms of that directive, combustion plants built after 1987 had to comply with specific emissions limits. But from 2007, plants built earlier than that could either opt to comply with the emissions limits or opt out and just basically accept closure. And among those that accepted closure were UK power stations at Grain, Kingsnorth, Ferrybridge, Ironbridge, and, as we all know, Didcot A. But across Europe, that's more than 200 plants that have opted out, to put another nail in the coffin, I guess, of our fossil fuel past. All of this has led to the awarding of some very large and some very impressive decommissioning and demolition contracts at these now defunct power stations. But what about the facilities, structures and infrastructure that got left behind, the so-called climate orphans? Here to discuss that is Martin Bjerregaard of D3 Consulting, a company that, among other things, is tasked with actually taking care of some of these climate orphans. And Martin started as an explosive technician back in 1989 and has since been involved in demolition literally around the world as a contractor, consultant and researcher. But in 2011, he set up D3 Consulting, a consultancy that focuses on complex decommissioning and waste management. So he's the man to talk about with this. Good morning, Martin.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good to see you. Glad to see you looking well. I've done a bit of a preamble there, but let's cut to the chase here, Martin. One of the core skills of your company is looking after what you describe as climate orphan facilities. For a start, what are climate orphans and what does looking after them actually look like?
Well, I initially termed them climate rejects, which was probably more of a provocative statement to generate a bit of a discussion. For me, I think seeing how we're moving towards renewables and we're leaving behind the fossil fuel infrastructure, which I'm all for and I appreciate and I understand it. But, you know, there's a lot of investment, a lot of attention going to renewables. And I have this growing feeling that we are neglecting some of what we're leaving behind. There are some initiatives which are looking after to try and repurpose and reuse them, but often the revenue stream is from the renewables. So I posted after having talked to some colleagues and industry people about climate rejects. So my sort of philosophy on climate rejects is all of that infrastructure which we're leaving behind and we don't really want or need anymore. And then I read BNP Paribas, asset management, about how these large infrastructures should have some sort of asset retirement obligation, and the funding of that could actually support what we do with these rejects. So then I changed it to maybe the renewables and sector should adopt these rejects as orphans. So now I'm calling them climate orphans. So basically, I think we have a real responsibility to look after this infrastructure in a proper way and not just get distracted with all of the future.
But looking at those facilities, and I have visited, probably not as many as you, but I've visited a few, and a lot of them have been sort of earmarked for decommissioning, deconstruction, demolition, and my guess is that a lot of them will end up being the site for housing developments and that kind of thing. So what are these orphans that are being left behind? I guess it's not the power stations themselves.
Well, it's the power stations. It's also the infrastructure around them. It's oil and gas as well. So we work a lot with offshore platforms in the North Sea, and there's a huge number of platforms which are being taken out of service. And so you've got the pipelines to shore, and then onshore you've got all the oil terminals, the gas terminals, and then you've got the hinterland. So everything that goes from one platform, you know, actually has quite a long infrastructure chain behind it. So when you take one out, there's infrastructure behind that crumbles as well. So it's the physical infrastructure which I'm sort of mainly focusing on here. And from our point of view, there's probably 4 real options. So if they're not going to go straight for decommissioning, then often there'll be a phase of what should we do with this site, which could last several years, and that's sort of the mothballing. And I've seen various degrees of successes of that, which is probably my real key concern, which I'd like to chat a bit more about. But then there's also repurposing. So we are seeing more and more clients who require sites that are close to water for cooling, that are already connected to the grid. So you could be looking at large battery storage, you could be looking at large transmission renewables. So there's an opportunity to repurpose some of these. There's also, the Dutch are very good at repurposing their offshore platforms, so repurposing them into hydrogen, solar, renewables, carbon capture. So there's lots of repurposing options. And then recycling, which I think is probably the smaller category. So when you take, take modern, perfect example of a turbine hall recycled into another purpose. But I think that's, as I said, that's probably the smaller category. Yeah.
You've mentioned your concerns over mothballing. Is that just because these structures that you're talking about become more dilapidated, or is it because they contain potentially hazardous or toxic materials? What is your primary concern there?
Well, it's those. So there's several concerns. One is, I think that this notion you can turn the key and leave a site and come back to it 2 or 3 years later, and it will be roughly as it was when you left it, when I think those of us that work in decommissioning and redundant sites know that it very quickly starts to dilapidate. So you've got, trying to create safe access again once you've left it to go back in. You've got, as you said, dilapidation leading to environmental leaks. You've got all the hydrocarbons, everything else starting to leak and go into the environment. You've got ecology. Ecology is a huge one. So if we don't look after these sites and board up them properly and prevent ecology from habitating, then we'll come back to a habitat which we then have to manage. Now that's kind of, there's a positive thing, you've created a habitat, but if you're going for decommissioning or for repurposing, we've been involved in quite a few sites where nothing happens for the first 9 months because we need to rehouse and we need to move habitats, we need to find new locations for them. So one of my concerns is the owners of these sites thinking, okay, we'll just put it aside for a couple of years and we'll come back to it. When they come back to it, the costs of re-entering and planning are very much higher than if they had sorted it earlier. And I understand cash is there's not a lot of cash flowing around for these sort of projects. So one thing that we would like to see more of is a thought through plan of how to put a site into mothball. So for example, preventing too many habitats. So you'd be decontaminating, you'd be going through hydrocarbon free, you'd be removing any of the hazardous, you'd be securing the site so that we don't get unauthorized people coming onto site messing around. You might even choose to remove the asbestos now rather than later, because that is also an issue we come back several years later. So I would like to see us get better and smarter at putting sites into mothball and having a plan for how we take them out, and appreciating that there's a bigger cost taking them out than there would have been if we dealt with them straight away.
See, there's a follow-up to that as well. I'm thinking specifically here about power stations, although you mentioned sort of offshore rigs and that kind of thing. We don't have too many contractors, certainly here in the UK, that are capable of tackling that sort of work. Do we have people that are equipped to properly mothball facilities and that kind of thing?
I don't think at the moment we have anybody as a single contractor who's able to do all of that. I think they could if they wanted to, and I think if I was a decommissioning contractor, I would be going to the clients that I know and those that I want to work for, and I would be talking to them about, okay, we understand you're probably not going to decommission this site, but what we can do as a decommissioning contractor is put together a team of ecologists, even archaeologists, consultants, hazardous materials, and put together a team like that for you, and we'll develop a roadmap of how you can put this site into mothball, safe, secure. We'll consult with the HSE, because the HSE has a growing concern, both offshore and onshore, about how these sites are getting left. So, you know, there's a regulatory liaison there with the HSE, the SEPA in Scotland, the EA, wherever you are, and put together a plan of how we're going to put this site into mothball. Because ultimately, I think it's a decommissioning contractor a best place to do that, because they're the ones ultimately who are going to come back onto site and have to deal with this. So if they had a good feel for what sort of things are key, for example, you know, access up on top of a tank. As soon as the steps going up to the tank aren't certified any longer, then that's a key issue as well. You can't just go recertify some steps and get up there. I mean, we're using drone footage. Instead of getting back up into tanks, we can use drones instead. But, you know, you have to think that through. And I think, so in summary, there aren't many decommissioning contractors who can handle large-scale projects like that in the UK. But I do think that by teaming, we could actually create quite a good a service there for the clients.
There was a time when, and I'm thinking again specifically here about power stations, that we used to take large chunks of them and send them off to bits of Africa or the third world for a second life. I take it that's not the case anymore.
I haven't seen it so much anymore, no. I think about 10, 15 years ago, pharmaceutical plants, for example, worked on a pharmaceutical plant that had only had, I would dare say, months in operation since commissioning. Match mark, cut up, sent abroad and built again. But we don't see that much anymore. Maybe there'll be a revival in that. However, I do think that with the increased skills and engineering of a lot of other countries, I don't think they really want our junk. So I'm not holding out for that being the future. I do think that, yes, obviously there's a scrap value. The whole repurposing of a site is not so straightforward, because you've got a lot of permitting, you've got a lot of changing use, you've got a lot of other aspects than the physical partial decommissioning and refitting and whatever, which I think are quite complicated and probably the higher risk and costly than doing the work. So yes, there's scrap metal value there, but it's a balance. It's a balance between, you know, should a large battery storage plant be built somewhere else on another brownfield, or should it be built here? That in itself can lead some consultants and accountants a whole year's discussion. So when it comes to the actual work, then that's the straightforward bit, I think.
You've mentioned the word scrap there a couple of times, which there was a time when demolition men used to rub their hands together when anyone mentioned scrap. Not quite so much anymore. Has the fall in scrap prices, and I know they fluctuate, but has the fall in scrap prices killed the appetite for this kind of work?
I don't think it's killed the appetite. I think it's just changed the dialogue between the clients and the contractors. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, you know, clients weren't that astute to the value of scrap. I think now there's a lot more knowledge around scrap value. We see a lot more contracts getting structured so that there's a gain share on the scrap value and the non-ferrous. So the ferrous is quite easy to understand. It's the non-ferrous, you know. Has it got alloy, as a not, as, you know, what's copper, what's not. So looking at more detailed materials inventories for sites to inform clients of what the real value of what they've got. So I think we're getting much better informed clients going into contracts with contractors. So I don't see these large sites being the big win that they were for decommissioning contractors in the past. I think the allocation of credits and gain shares, as well as risks, are being better structured in contracts. And by risks, you know, who knows what's going to happen with ferrous and non-ferrous as we come out of this coronavirus. Again, if we look at the past recessions that we've had, sometimes they've bounced back quite well. But I don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. If you do, Mark, you can tell me. That'll be good.
Hey, listen, if I knew, I'd be keeping that information to myself.
Yeah.
You have a very interesting position in the fact that you get to you can take an overview of these things because you kind of sit above all of this. If you were made sort of king of decommissioning for the day, what is your solution to these climate orphans or climate rejects that you've described?
You know what, my solution would be along the lines of, instead of all of the different owners of these sites, be they energy, be they oil and gas operators, whatever, I think there's a model to be discussed whereby the government steps in, or sort of, you know how the nuclear decommissioning is under the NDA. I don't think it's too far removed for us, especially within oil and gas, let's say, to have a single entity that takes these sites and takes responsibility for them, because we'll get a lot of cost saving by campaigning across sites, by having a more intelligent and informed approach to how to manage several sites at the same time. So if I was king of decommissioning for the day, I would decree that a lot of these sites came in under a single entity that was responsible for their decommissioning on behalf of the community or the society. That, you know, it's not going to come tomorrow, but I think that would be a good avenue to go down, especially when we look at something like the oil and gas decommissioning of the offshore platforms, where the government, well, you and I, Mark, as taxpayers, are actually going to stump up a fair portion of the cost for decommissioning these plants. So I think there's a cause there for the taxpayer to actually say, hang on, we think there's a better way to do this. Let's pull it all into one entity and manage it properly.
I think one of the interesting things I find with this, and I'm thinking more specifically now about the offshore, is there does seem to be not quite a bottomless pit of cash, but I did read somewhere that they'd, in order to recover certain platforms, they'd basically designed and built a ship at a cost of about £2 billion.
Yeah.
So, you know, there is money there and the will. You would think that, you know, as you say, to put a body in place to actually oversee all of this and to make sure that it's done in the right way and you know, safely and effectively and everything else, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man, really, should it?
It shouldn't. And, you know, maybe we're going that way because the oil and gas authority, the OGM, has been set up in the last couple of years. And there's a lot of concern around, for example, the mothballing of offshore platforms, because oil prices are now really low and there's not very much cash in the operators' pockets to spend on decommissioning. So decommissioning is a dead cost. It's, you know, you're not going to get any revenue from that. And absolutely, if I was an operator, I'd be putting my money into something I get a revenue and a return on. So we're not sure what's going to happen with decommissioning and offshore decommissioning in the offshore world. But which again leads to, well, it's a bit of a pain for some of these operators to have to deal with this cost. Why not put it to someone who's been specially set up to deal with it? And yes, there's a lot of investment in offshore decommissioning. The North Sea was pretty much one of the first large areas, apart from the Gulf of Mexico, and we've built up some real skills in the North Sea offshore decommissioning, and we're seeing other parts of the world come to the North Sea and ask, you know, what have you learned and what can we learn, and can you come and help in our area? So I think that investment in vessels is not just for the North Sea, it's a global investment.
Now, given the fact that most of our audience today will be, or today and going forward, will be demolition people, should they be rubbing their hands together at the prospect of getting their hands on all these climate rejects, or is the current crisis and the likely economic fallout from that likely to push this back even further?
I'm not sure about rubbing hands. I think there's a cause to, as a demolition contractor, to think maybe a little bit beyond just the demolition. And I think going a little bit back to what I was earlier referring to is engaging with the owners and saying, you know, we realize at the moment it's pretty difficult for you. You probably haven't got loads of money to spend on this site. What can we help with? Maybe we take down a couple of the buildings, and then you've got some warehousing you can then rent out, and we manage and board up the other buildings. We drain them first for you so they're ready to come back to. So I think there is there's an opportunity there for demolition contractors to maybe broaden that dialogue they have with the owners of these sites. I don't think we're going to see a huge upsurge in demolition after this. I think the next 2 years are going to be pretty much owners of these sites sitting and waiting and seeing what's going to happen. That's just my projection.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch anyway. Where can viewers find out more about you, Martin, and D3 Consulting? And I don't know if there is any other reading on this subject out there, whether you're forging the path. So where can people find out more?
Our website's a good start, d3-consulting.com. But I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on the end of a phone. And soon, hopefully, I'll be in a car. Who knows? So no, phone call, email, or our website. Just have a chat.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today, Martin. I do find that very interesting. I'll put this up on YouTube later for anyone that's missed it. We've had a good audience watching there. No comments, so it shows the fact that you're answering all the questions, I guess. So I'm going to let you get back to the day job, such as it is at the moment, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Martin. Cheers. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed that. As I said earlier, it's a bit of a one-off. Obviously, we always broadcast at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we will be doing so today as well. Just had a comment come in there. We'll be connecting with you, Martin. Excellent chat. Thank you for that, Peter. Really appreciate it. Martin is a very knowledgeable guy, as you can see. One thing that I would throw in there. Part of the reason that I jumped on speaking to Martin in the way that I have, I watched a Netflix documentary a few weeks back called Planet of the Humans, which is talking primarily about clean energy, so solar power and wind power and all these kind of things. But one of the things that's very interesting about it is, well, partly is the fact that clean energy, as it turns out, is not quite as clean as everyone would have you believe. But also, it makes quite a big reference to, you know, the legacy that we've left behind with some of our coal-fired power stations and that kind of thing. So if you are on Netflix, go and have a look. It's as I say, I think Michael Moore, the film director, was involved in it. It's not one of his films specifically, but he was involved in it. So it does have its political leanings, no question about that. But it does make for very interesting and sometimes troubling viewing. Planet of the Humans over on Netflix. So without further ado, I'm going to get back because I'm going to write a script for 3 o'clock this afternoon. We've got a guest this afternoon, which is Jacqueline O'Donovan, my apologies. I've got Michael Moore on the brain. Jacqueline O'Donovan, who is talking about what she perceives as a creeping complacency in our social distancing, which, given all that Boris Johnson said last night about us going back to work potentially rather sooner than some of us would like, should make for an interesting view. So please check back at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Hope to see you there. Again, thanks a lot for your time today. Thanks, Martin, for being here. And I'll see you all again at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.